morning. How's the sound? Is it loud enough at the back? Thank you. All right. What you've been reading about and what I've been talking about for the past few days is what happened after the end of the French-Indian War. British victory, British colonists' victory, but the British were concerned. First of all, they needed some assistance, and it seemed reasonable to ask for that assistance from the British colonists of mainland North America. They needed some assistance in paying their war debt, and they needed to remind the colonists that they were colonists. Yes, they were colonists of the British Empire, and that was a wonderful, mighty thing, but, you know, they were colonists, and there were certain rules and regulations to being colonists, and these colonists didn't seem to be always abiding by them. So, British reforms, taxes, the Sugar Act, and so on. And the British were very surprised at the, what seemed to them, extreme reaction. The colonists were surprised that the British were so surprised. What? I mean, we're talking about our rights as Englishmen. And we learned about those rights as Englishmen from being in English colonies. Come on. I mean, at the very least, there was a complete lack of appreciation of each other's views. But there was really more at stake than that. For the British Empire, if the colonists continued to be successful in protesting and rejecting taxes, then someday they might be, especially after the protest to the Townshend tax, what if they began to protest the Navigation Acts, those tariffs, that had been on the books for over 100 years, and that the colonists had not complained about? I mean, there was some smuggling, but for the most part, things had been going along pretty smoothly. Until the British called attention to the smuggling, and until Parliament imposed some taxes. And I remind you, as George Tyndall, an historian, said, for the colonists, in those decades of what we call salutary neglect, the first 5 or 6 decades of the 1700s, the 18th century, first government became a habit, self-government, and then it became a right. So, resistance leads, in this case, to revolution. In 1774, Lord North was the minister in charge of administering these sorts of things, British. He presided over the Parliament's passage of what they called the Coercive Acts, because Lord North and the majority in Parliament believed that the colonists clearly had to be coerced into behaving once again like colonists. And if that meant recognizing the authority of Parliament that they hadn't had to do before, it just hadn't come up, then they had to do that. The Coercive Acts. It's no mistake that the colonists referred to them as the Intolerable Acts. And this was after the Boston Tea Party, which of course had angered the British. And not surprisingly, one of the Coercive Acts was to close Boston to merchant shipping. Yeah, and to establish military rule in Massachusetts. Military rule. That seemed awfully close to despotism from the colonists' perspective. The Coercive Acts also made British officials immune to any criminal prosecution in America. And it required colonists to quarter, to shelter, to provide rooms for British troops. And then the very same year, Parliament passed the Quebec Act. Now, looking at the map, and you've seen versions of these maps several times by now, but the map on the left, before the French-Indian War, the pre-war boundaries, and then the disputed area that both the British and the French claimed, all right? And then after the war, the British are triumphant. And so all of the territory east of the Mississippi, France cedes, C-E-D-E-S, to the British. Everything that they had claimed in what we call Canada, the French cede to the British. The Spanish still hold their claim to the New France, some of which had been French territory, Louisiana. Okay. And then there's Pontiac's Rebellion, and during Pontiac's Rebellion, the British declare the Proclamation Line of 1763. And they station British soldiers, at various points along that line. They do that because, though they eventually defeated Pontiac and the Confederation of different Native American tribes of the Ohio River Valley, they could not keep fighting these wars against confederations of Native Americans who were angry about English-speaking colonists taking their land. Now, the English had taken a lot of their land and had not batted an eye about it, but they did not want to have to fight another war anytime soon. So, the Proclamation Line of 1763 essentially says to the colonists, you cannot move west of here. Now, what's unstated is that, maybe later we'll work something out, but right now, my God, the Indians are so upset. You cannot move west of here because there will be another war and you'll want us to come help you, and we can't afford to do that. And the Proclamation Line of 1763 was also a message to Pontiac and the Native American tribes of that area. You must respect people that live on the frontier and east of the Proclamation Line of 1763. I know you used to live there, but you don't now. So that's that. And then, of course, the British defeated the Native American Confederation, and that was a part of the treaty, and that was that. That really was that. Pontiac agreed to it, agreed to these boundaries. Now, I want you to look at something on the map to the right. Can you see the Ohio River? It's indicated by a blue line. You see it? Okay. Keep that in mind. Now, the Proclamation Line is east of that. Okay? Now, all of that pink up north of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, that is now English territory. Okay? But some of it used to be settled by the French, including Quebec. All right, and you see Quebec. The Quebec Act passed in 1774. In some ways, a very curious piece of legislation. The Quebec Act extended territory to the province of Quebec. Now, this is no longer French territory, but most of the people, if not all of the people, that live in Quebec are French people. They're French people. They're Roman Catholic people. They did not leave the continent after the French were defeated in 1763. They're still there. Their families had been there for 2 or 3 generations. They're staying there, okay? Well, the Quebec Act. Yeah. Okay, let me pause for a moment. I should have clicked on this earlier. The Intolerable Acts. This is an interesting cartoon. It is depicting the person laying down in the drapery-like stuff. That's a depiction of America. And America is being forced to drink this medicine that the bloody British are forcing down America's throat. Okay. Now, the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act extended territory for Quebec province. It's under British control, but the local government of Quebec province, certainly there are French people involved in that local government. And extending that territory means that the descendants of the French people that live in the smaller Quebec can move down there. And it means that if French from the continent want to move there and be among other French-speaking people, they can certainly do that. Now, why do you think the British Empire, they had just defeated France? They'd been at war with France for years. But this is not France. These are French-speaking people. They're Roman Catholic people. But they extend this territory down as a way of warning the colonists. You are not the only people that have claim to this land. This land belongs to the British Empire. And we can have Quebec colony that includes French people, just like there are Swedes and Dutch and so on in some of the so-called English colonies of the mainland. Now, can you find the Ohio River here? Just barely, it's not marked, but you see the Ohio River, that blue line, going through the what's called the Indian Reserve. The Ohio River eventually meets with the Mississippi River, all right? And you will note that some of the territory in Quebec, according to the Quebec Act, look at the Ohio River here, and Quebec. In other words, the British had said with the Proclamation of 1763, had said, that is a line beyond which you may not pass, because everything west of that for a ways is Indian territory. But you see, they had carved off some of what they had called Indian territory to make way for this enlarged Quebec. I mean, they're kind of thumbing their nose at the colonists. And the colonists are infuriated. Right next door, there's going to be a colony of French-speaking people. They're Roman Catholics. What if their numbers grow and they try to re-Catholicize or Catholicize some of the British-speaking colonies? Well, now that was not going to happen. It did not happen. But it angered the colonists, which in a way was the intention. Now, you see the 13 colonies, Indian territory. You can identify the Ohio River, and what was added to Quebec. These are the boundaries in 1774. Well, the colonists are very agitated. They are extremely agitated. In 1774, they call for a meeting of what they call the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress in the United States. And they convene in Philadelphia, and they're representatives, 56 in all, from all of the colonies except for Georgia. And they draft a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and they elect the Virginian Peyton Randolph as the first president of the Congress. Now, it is at this Congress that Patrick Henry, who would later say, "Give me liberty or give me death," it is at this Congress that Patrick Henry would say, near the close of this Congress, they'd been working together, and he says, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not Virginian, but I'm an American." He's identifying himself as an American. I'm not sure anybody had done that before. This is rather a big deal. And it's going to take a while. It's going to take a long while. 200 or 300 years maybe, for people to think of themselves as Americans first and members of their colonies or states second. Well, the Continental Congress creates the Continental Association, which called for almost a complete halt to trade with Great Britain. And the Continental Association encourages domestic manufacturing. Let's just make what we need, grow what we need. We're not buying anything from England. We'll show them we don't need them. And they won't make any money off of us. And local in various colonies, committees of public safety, local committees of safety, emerged to oversee the mandates of the Continental Association. Now, what this meant was these committees of public safety, or these committees of safety, in the towns of the other colonies, they were to kind of keep an eye on merchants and farmers and whoever else. And if someone on the committee of safety suspected that some merchant was about to make a deal to import certain British goods, that person was going to try to discourage that merchant from doing so. Because if a lot of people did that, then this boycott would have no effect. Okay. Now, at the same time, local committees and colonies began to extend to small farmers and other people in the countryside. And so, increasingly, it wasn't just merchants and artisans and politicos in the cities, but also people of the countryside who were aroused by and now involved in this resistance. This is spreading, and they feel a part of this resistance. They've never participated in even colonial politics before. And more people are participating in this resistance. Okay, well, Massachusetts, not surprisingly, because martial law had been proclaimed in Massachusetts, it becomes sort of the center point for resistance. And it forms a shadowy revolutionary government and establishes militias to resist the increasing military presence. And so it's not at all surprising that the first shots fired before there was a declaration of war were in Massachusetts. This is about the First Continental Congress. And the British knew about an armory, a cache of weapons. And they decided to get those weapons so that they were British weapons, so that they could not be used by the colonists. Let's just get them and take them back. So they're marching to Concord. They go through Lexington. Well, the militia tried to keep them from getting to, the Massachusetts militia, tried to keep them from getting to Concord by closing down the bridge at Lexington. There's shooting. And then on to Concord, there is a battle. And this is a regular, the British line, the militia line battle. And people are killed. This is what Emerson later referred to as the shot heard round the world. And then there is the Second Continental Congress, 1775. Now, not everybody is on board with this resistance at all. In fact, some historians estimate that in the resistance and during the Revolution, only about a third of the population were patriots and supporters of the Revolution. And another third were loyalists. They were opposed to the Revolution. And many of them moved to Canada, which was not Quebec, but moved to Canada, which was a British colony, but not one of the below Canada 13 mainland colonies. Many of them went back to Britain, or went to Britain. And I'll show you a slide that gives you the arguments of the loyalists in a moment. Excuse me. Oh. Thank you. Okay. I have taken my allergy pills. So, the loyalists. Now, many of the loyalists weren't thrilled about the British reforms. Some thought, well, you know, what's the big deal? They fought to help us. I mean, it's, you know, there were loyalists, colonists, who were not that offended by the British reforms. And they argued with those who were resisting the British reforms. So about a third of the population, some people estimate, were patriots, about a third were loyalists, and about a third, they didn't really care, they just wanted to stay out of it. Maybe less than a third. But the loyalists, even those that also disagreed with some of the British actions, thought, you know, if we split with Britain, things here in the colonies will just devolve into anarchy. Yes, this was not great, but we need to stay in the empire and we need to try to make changes, and it sure as hell is better than anarchy. Because they're aware that in some of the colonies there had been some restlessness and some difficulties, so on. So they just think, you know, making a change this big, like people are talking about separating from the empire. It's like, my God. I mean, the British Empire, it's huge. England has a long history. England has the Constitution that we learned from. How bad can it be? So, they're making a reasonable argument, which is why some historians have written about the American Revolution being something of a civil war. Not that there were actual battles between the loyalists and the patriots, but some who were loyalists fought with the British. Some who were loyalists laid low. Some who were loyalists provided information to the British. Some who were loyalists, most who were loyalists, just stayed out of it and hoped for the best. And many moved. But it's important to know that not everybody was, this was not a unanimous movement by any means. So, the Second Continental Congress is in session in 1775. And even the men at the Continental Congress, and these are all people that are part of the resistance, they would call themselves patriots. They're very angry with Britain, but declaring independence, do we want to go that far? Let's try for a compromise one more time. So, they write up a compromise proposal, an olive branch, if you will, that they send to the king. And the language is very, 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 very respectful. And it's not overbearing. And they don't ask for the moon. But the king rejects it completely. He doesn't even say, let's talk some more. No, the king rejects it, and that's it. That rips it. That's it. But that's not completely it. We don't know how much to weigh the king's rejection of this olive branch proposal against other things, but clearly, one thing that moved a great amount of opinion closer to independence was the publication in January of 1776 of Common Sense, a political pamphlet, probably one of the most significant political pamphlets ever written. It was written by Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine he was English. He'd only been in the colonies for a couple of years. But rather immediately, he was struck by what he saw to be the justice of the patriot cause. Now, one of your reading assignments, you can look at this tonight, and you can look at this tonight. It would be useful for you to do that. Thomas Paine. It is quite possible, one could make an argument that Thomas Paine's publication of this very strong argument sort of seals the deal, convinces those who had not been completely sure. He makes several arguments, but I cluster them together to say that there are two central arguments. And one of his arguments is to say, you colonists should have no faith in the British Constitution to protect you. Yes, the British Constitution is a wonderful thing, but do not think you are deluded if you think appealing to the British Constitution is any form of protection. He says Britain's relationship, the Constitution is neither here nor there really when it comes to the colonies, because Britain's relationship with the colonies predated the Constitution. Most of the Constitution predated 1688, certainly. And Britain's relationship with the colonies is based on Britain's interest. It is not based on affection or attachment. It is not based on political principle. The colonists exist because it serves Britain's economic self-interest. That's that. The colonists in mainland North America, Britain's colonies anywhere. Now, up to this point, the colonists had avoided attacking the king. They had attacked Parliament. They heaped blame on Parliament and on the king's ministers. But Paine attacks the institution of the monarchy. He says, what? You know, the monarchy and the aristocracy. I'm quoting, the most prosperous invention the devil ever set on foot for the promotion of idolatry. And to a primarily Protestant audience, Thomas Paine writes and reviles the monarchy as the popery of government. The British monarch, while unable to rule absolutely as an absolute despot over England because of the Constitution and the recognition of Parliament, was able to wield despotic power over the colonies if he chose to do so. There's nothing in the Constitution ruling that out. The king had more power in the colonies than he had in England. In England, concerned for his own good, he's only going to support those laws that keep England strong. And he's going to limit conflict with Parliament. It's in the king's interest to limit his conflict with Parliament. But in America, there are no similar limitations on what the king might do or say or order or implement. So, if oppressing the colonists with taxes or martial law or whatever is in the interest of England and in the interest of the king, he's not going to oppose it if Parliament suggests it, and if he can do it himself, he will. Furthermore, Paine argued that it was absolutely absurd for people living in the mainland colonies, people living in the mainland colonies of North America in the Western Hemisphere. He says it is absolutely absurd that this distant island of England could rule over the expansive continent of America. Now, at the time, the colonies did not expand over the continent of America. The colonies were with 50 to 100 miles from the Atlantic coast. But you see, and pay attention to this, he is already talking about America as a continent. And other people began talking about, or maybe people were already thinking of America as the North American continent. Certainly they thought of America as all of the English-held territory to the Mississippi. If the colonies declare their independence from England, they're going to claim all the territory up to the Mississippi River as the colonies in declaring their independence. But it's really just this strip. But they're thinking big. Thomas Paine is certainly thinking big. How absurd it is to think of an island ruling over the continent of America that's an ocean away. Britain was too far away. The British are too ignorant of the situation in the colonies. The interests of England and the interests of the colonies are disparate. They're not the same. England is not only smaller in size, Thomas Paine argues, but it is smaller in moral stature. That's what he says, and that really puffs up the colonists. Because his next big argument is to affirm American nationalism and to affirm a belief that America has a special destiny. You hear some echoes here? Yes, it was only a small colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that talked about being a city on a hill. But other Americans in other colonies, and this is certainly through the Great Awakening, you know, there's really something special about us. We're the most Protestant. We work the hardest. We're the most prosperous. We don't have to have a landed aristocracy. Yeah, we have the most rights for the most people. Very, very proud of themselves. And Thomas Paine is impressed as well, and he plays on this. I'm quoting from Common Sense. I think this is remarkable. Listen to this. He wrote, "The Reformation," you remember the Reformation? Luther, 1517, King Henry VIII, you remember that? The Reformation was preceded by the discovery of America, so as if the Almighty graciously meant to open a sanctuary to the persecuted in future years, when home should afford neither friendship nor safety. He is suggesting that the European discovery of the Western Hemisphere and then the Reformation is all a part of God's plan. That a part of this Western Hemisphere will become a sanctuary for people of the true Christian religion, the religion of the Reformation. And he says, you know, England belongs to Europe. England is European. This is something new. England belongs to a civilization that has countenanced monarchy and aristocracy for centuries. And that civilization cannot protect American liberties. America, on the other hand, is something quite apart and quite different. America belongs to itself. So new and so different. It cannot be ruled by something so old and so unlike America. He anticipates, or perhaps even points the way to, a view of government that would become the much proclaimed virtue of America. In America, the government will be a government of laws and not men. The King of America will be the law, Thomas Paine wrote. And it will be based upon divine law, sanctioned by divine law. Nothing less than the Word of God. That will be American law. So Thomas Paine argued. Now, a republic, the definition, this word republic, you know by now that a republic means a government without a king. Typically, with consent of the governed. And that consent is typically acquired through representation. Paine concludes his argument with an appeal that, oh wow, it's still passionate in its rhetoric. And it was bound to affect the colonists who felt besieged by what was seeming to be a corrupt overlord, England, and who had this intense fear of tyranny. Now, remember, however unwise British reforms or actions were, however unwilling they were to immediately respect the way the colonists wanted to govern themselves. I don't think anybody can make an argument that the British actually intended to enslave the colonists. But remember where they're coming from. Remember the language of the Glorious Revolution and of the Country Party. And these people know what slavery is. They have an intense fear of tyranny. An imbalance of power can lead to tyranny. So, when Thomas Paine closes his argument, he says, "O ye," let's see, no, I don't have it. "O ye that love mankind, ye that dare not oppose, only ye that dare oppose, not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled freedom. Europe regards freedom like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind." Whoa. Wow. Well, I don't know what he knew about Asia and Africa. I don't think very much, but, you know. But America had clearly outgrown the comfort or tolerance they could have for their place as colonies of an empire. Paine, "We have it in our power to begin the world again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now." Wow. I mean, have you ever been a part of anything where you thought you were beginning the world over again and creating a sanctuary for mankind? Good Lord. What a mission. And so, the king turns down the Olive Branch Plan, and in July of 1776, at the Second Continental Congress, the Declaration Committee meets, and Thomas Jefferson, of course, heads it and does most of the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, you need to read the Declaration of Independence in the back of your book and read it with this new understanding of the revolutionary ideology that has informed how colonists are seeing things. Read it, knowing that these people have heard Thomas Paine's argument. It's addressed to King George III. None of the previous resolutions had been. Now, I mentioned slavery. Well, all 13 colonies had slave codes. There were very few slaves in some colonies. But it's also true that even before this revolutionary decade, there were abolition groups in all 13 colonies. They were small, they weren't a big deal, but there had always been a few people in every colony that thought, you know, this isn't right. We're not supposed to do this. This really, treating people as property, this is not okay. And with the revolutionary rhetoric, all men are created equal. This is talked about in the taverns. Slaves hear these words. Women hear these words. Neither slaves nor women can vote. Landless farmers or landless artisans hear these words. What do you mean equal? I can't even vote. But the slavery issue is what attracts the attention of a significant few. Slavery continues, as you know, but even some of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, even some of the men at the Constitutional Convention said as early as 1776, my God, we'll be struck down as hypocrites. Because this Declaration of Independence, by a slave-holding set of colonies, this is, here's the term, monstrous inconsistency. It's a monstrous inconsistency. Well, we just have to overlook that for now. But you know it comes up again. It comes up again in the 90s. The second decade of government as the United States of America, and it keeps coming up. I'm not doing the military history. I direct you to Foner for that. He does a better job of that than I could. The test Friday, bring a blue book, bring a pen and pencil, and I'll see you.
Test purposes, like I know we should probably have a little knowledge of the Paleolithic time period, like maybe the English.
I'm not sure, but I think I wrote on the study guide that the question would not be about initial or documentary.
I missed last class. Do y'all have a spare note card? Pick one up.
Oh, gosh, I've got thousands of them, but I don't have them with me.